From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Mike Sexton, director of MEI's cyber program, sitting in this week for Alastair. Today, we're going to be talking about Iranian hacking and disinformation and what it might mean for the 2020 presidential election. Joining us today are Emerson T. Brooking, a best-selling author and international security policy analyst who focuses on emerging trends and conflict, including through the internet and social media. Brooking is a resident fellow at the Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council and is the co-author of Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media, along with P.W. Singer. We're also joined by Steph Shample, a senior analyst at Flashpoint, a cyber threat intelligence company. Shample has previously worked in intelligence at the U.S. Army and the Department of Defense. Her work focuses on ransomware, cryptocurrencies, and the dark web. So we're here to parse through three major news stories from the past few weeks. First is that Iran has been reported to have attempted to breach email addresses associated directly and indirectly with Donald Trump's re-election campaign. The second is Facebook has taken down 4 different disinformation networks on Facebook and Instagram, 3 of which originated in Iran and 1 from Russia. The groups have engaged in coordinated inauthentic behavior targeting the U.S., North Africa, and Latin America. And the third story is that a Russian hacking group known as Turla has hijacked Iranian hacking tools and computer infrastructure to hack organizations in at least 20 countries, according to the NSA and the British GCHQ. So I want to start with you, Steph. Can you tell me how exactly did Iran try to breach these email accounts, and where does that land on the scale of Iran's total offensive cyber capability?
Sure, absolutely. First, I just want to say thank you to Mike and the Middle Eastern Institute for having me. It's always a pleasure to work with you, especially on a subject like this. So this TTP that you're talking about is definitely one of the charming kitten or phosphorus or APT35, however you know the group. So there was a wonderful report that came out in 2018, and that was by CERTFA Labs. And then in 2019, we've seen 2 additional reports, and it deals with how Iran is breaching these email accounts and what they're doing. So without getting too technical, but trying to cover the various methods that they have. So they will definitely go and create fake personalities on Instagram, Facebook, even LinkedIn to target that professional community. And they'll back up that first tranche of fake personalities that they create with a second tranche of fake personalities to appear to be even more legitimate. And so from there, with using their fake personalities, they might request to friend their intended victims on any of the platforms, or they'll issue requests to the friends or other connections of their intended victim and build trust that way. But the initial first stage appears to be all about building trust, and there's nothing really malicious. So they go for that. There's no real rush on their part. They're really thorough and they do their research. And then they might start an email campaign or a different way of approaching their contacts. So they might send a resume, maybe via messaging on LinkedIn, and ask for a review, or maybe they'll pose as a journalist or a peer in the same workspace, right? So, Mike, for instance, because this group tailors to it. So you have a profile on MiddleEastInstitute.com, right? And so maybe you get a Facebook or Twitter or LinkedIn account request saying, hey, Mike, I'm a Middle Eastern researcher too, or I really love cyber. Mm-hmm. And so they might come into your inbox. Yeah. So be careful, you see. Yeah. That's where that trust comes in. So you might see them come into your inbox or come into your messaging. They try to discuss with you. Or use flattery, right? Like, hey, you're such a great professional. Here's my resume. Do you have any tips? Can you get me a job? And once you click on, let's say that, if you click on a news link or if you click on that resume or whatever attachment they might use, that's kind of where they get you. So you might not see that, that redirects to a .org or a .net, or that attachment that they've sent is malicious. And so again, I'm going to keep it high level and I'm not going to go technical, but if you click on that link or if you click on that attachment, likely your credentials are harvested. And so then they have that and they can maintain that. Then they can take over your other accounts, right? Because a lot of people reuse passwords. So if your Gmail clicks on this link, but you have the same password for your LinkedIn and your Yahoo or whatever, or even your work account, right? that's definitely going to be a threat. And that's why they've been so successful for it, is because people do reuse it. And then furthermore, there's trackers in the emails that they use. So the more sophisticated actors, everybody knows that cookies come on websites. These actors will use a form of a cookie too, and they can say, okay, did they forward this email? Who clicked on this link? Was it the Microsoft address? Was it a Google address? Was it the LinkedIn person? Where else can I pivot to now and try to expand this compromise? And so that's their TTPs and kind of how they go about approaching and building their network.
So that sounds kind of a cut above what was originally in the Microsoft report on the targeting of the presidential campaign, which was that they were trying to reset their passwords and then get in through that way by, guessing what their first pet's name or the street they grew up on. It sounds like they're significantly more sophisticated than what has just been reported in that specific instance. Is that right?
That's right. So that's part of it too, just the password reset, but they've got to get a way for you to trust them, and they've got to get a way to even compromise one account to move laterally or to move within a network. Mm-hmm. So I'm combing the CERTFA reports in addition to the two Clear Sky reports, which complement the Microsoft report. And that is how they go about all of this. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So pivoting from hacking to disinformation, Brooking, can you tell us a little bit about Iran's disinformation and political influence campaigns? Can you tell us when Iran started doing this and what sorts of political positions or what kinds of news stories it tries to boost through social media?
So first off, Iranian influence activities go back a long way, I think a lot longer than most observers in the space realize. The earliest Twitter influence accounts that have been attributed to Iran actually date to 2008. So there have basically been a series of evolutions that Iranian influence operations have gone through, from limited Twitter sock puppet accounts trying to shape debate to a growing number of Facebook pages that masquerade as news outlets, but actually are just reposting and redistributing Iranian state propaganda. Mm-hmm. And then more sophisticated influence efforts that really imitate and use some of the techniques that Steph just described, where they might identify individual journalists, and even if they're not trying to compromise their password information, they basically use them as sources to try to launder highly targeted news articles through this digital ecosystem. But what's also interesting is the history of tracking Iranian disinformation and influence ops, because influence operations on the net really came to a lot of people's attention after the 2016 U.S. election and the revelations regarding Russian capabilities in this space. I remember in 2017, there were a ton of independent researchers who were, say, looking at Twitter, looking for suspicious influence networks and trying to figure out which ones were Russian. In 2018, Twitter did its first affirmative attribution of these influence networks, and they picked out a number of Russian accounts, but they also picked out a number of Iranian accounts, which people had been independently attributing as Russian. So this awareness of this Iranian influence apparatus has really only started in the last year, but there have been a cascade of stories and takedowns by the major social media companies. By my count, there have been 6 major takedown announcements just by Facebook alone targeting Iran, which puts it just right behind Russia in terms of the number. In terms of the scale, it's equivalent or might even be more so. To date, we've had something like 800 Facebook pages with 5.5 million followers that have been targeting basically every region in the world. There have been 344 Instagram accounts, which have had about 500,000 followers. And on Twitter, about 8,000 users, fake sock puppet accounts, which have had around 10 million transmitted messages. So it's of a significant scale. But if you're thinking about the content that this apparatus in general is distributing, a great example can be found in this most recent takedown by Facebook. One of the 3 Iranian influence networks they identified targeted English-speaking internet populations and primarily targeted the United States. And what they were doing on Facebook was basically spamming links to a website called blmnews.com, or Black Lives Matter News. And the page was ostensibly, quote, the source of African American news all around the world. But if you looked at the content on that page, you'd have a lot of stories about Hezbollah in a positive light. You'd have a lot of negative stories about the IDF. You'd have a lot of very positive stories about BDS, the boycott, divest, sanctions movement. And you'd have significant negative coverage of the Saudi intervention in Yemen. And that, in general, characterizes most of the content that this giant network puts out.
So to just to sort of follow up on that and bring in the question of 2016, I can recall in 2016 seeing that among the sort of fake Facebook pages that Russia had put up, there would be patriots for gun rights and they were politically all over the map, and some of them were specifically targeting Black Lives Matter. And I've noticed with RT's coverage in particular, they actually do a very close coverage of things like police shootings and these sorts of stories that sort of tend to build up more divisions in the United States and negative sentiment about the country and law enforcement. Can you tell me how Iran's sort of messaging is similar or different from Russia's in 2016?
From what I've seen and gathered, looking at the full extent of this network, Iranian messaging is fundamentally different from the Russian effort. If you look at Russian disinformation, it was often very opportunistic. There was no particular ideological view they were espousing. Rather, they would find the extreme poles on either side. Often they would create fake accounts that pushed extreme views in both directions, the intent being to fracture another political society. In the Iranian case, they're extremely consistent in the views they espouse. They are anti-Saudi. They seek to present Iran as an alternative leader of the Muslim world. They are generally anti-Western, but specifically anti-US, and in general push back against sanctions and what they perceive as like different neocolonialist ventures by the West. And I think you can see a lot of this Iranian network is basically an extension of Iranian foreign broadcasting. The Islamic Republic of Iran Broadcasting, the IRIB, is a big government agency in Iran that's charged with both state propaganda at home, but then also significant foreign broadcasting abroad. And they have big efforts in Arabic, in English, and in Spanish. And in fact, Iranian expenditures in foreign broadcasting are about equal to that of the United States. But if you break it down by the proportional size of the budgets, Iran's putting something like 50 times more in a foreign broadcasting than the United States. And that's just the public-facing stuff that we know about from like Iranian parliamentary reports. So this whole network is really just a different way to try to get that state perspective across. And we have seen limited cases where Iranians might pretend to be either American voters or they might masquerade as American voting outlets. But these outlets are almost always pushing content that directs viewers back to the Iranian state's point of view. It's not so much, say, trying to privilege one U.S. candidate over another, though that may change in the future.
So I want to pivot sort of back again to the future, into 2020. One of the most serious components of Russia's interference in 2016 was the hacking of the presidential campaigns themselves and the selective leaking of emails to damage support for Hillary Clinton. And because the leaked emails were newsworthy, they were reported on by the media. And so Russia had effectively co-opted American journalists in its campaign to undermine Hillary Clinton and get Donald Trump elected. Do we think it's possible Iran could seek to use a similar kind of strategy of co-opting the traditional mainstream media in 2020? We'll start with you, Steph.
Great. Yeah. So I do think that that's a consideration that we have to think will be repeated because it worked, right? And furthermore, Russia and Iran enjoy a really congenial relationship. So APT 35 has been actively working on modeling all of their campaigns and all of the things that Emerson just highlighted off of Russia's APT 28 Fancy Bear. Again, kind of highlighting that extremist and serving to try to fracture the American voting population and just really pit the American population against one another. And I think that they will definitely continue that. And I think that Iran is going to do whatever they can to support Russia because they need Russia as an ally. They've openly stated that they wanted to be more active in Russian endeavors for disinformation and challenging democratic processes. I think that Iran will continue to seek to emulate Russia because of the success that Russia's had, but also because of the support that Russia offers Iran. And this chaos in any American election or any election system, honestly, it foments a stronger relationship between them, but it also helps them advertise and really espouse their anti-Western world point of view, where, it's just like Emerson said for the campaigns, they promote Iran, they want to be a leader, they want to part on the world stage. And by doing these election activities, they can try for that, albeit it's not great, but they can try for it and see if it'll work.
Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah. When we think about the Western coverage of these disinformation attacks in general, and if we think about as we sort through what happened in 2016, I think we often miss taking a step back to really think about the strategic intent of our adversary. Russia didn't care if Donald Trump got elected. Russia's objective was to paralyze American foreign policy and NATO decision-making. So getting Trump elected was a tool to that end. I suspect if the opportunity arises, because it's been demonstrated that this sort of information laundering is so politically effective, I think if the opportunity arises, Iran would take the opportunity to leak information that might harm Trump with the intent of privileging one of his rivals. But that would not be because Iran has a particular interest in American politics, but because they would be seeking I think, a relaxation of the policies that the Trump administration has pursued. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder if we may not see Iran and Russia advocating for different sides of the American political spectrum simply because they're pursuing different goals. But it may also be the case because this disinformation and influence stuff is so easy. It doesn't require a significant investiture of resources. We may even see some parts of the Iranian state apparatus pushing against Trump while we continue to see the Iranian intelligence agencies and the more serious cyber actors working closely with Russians. Mm-hmm. So it's not really so cut and dried which side will fall where.
So it seems unlikely on its face, considering Russia's interference to support Trump in 2016 and Iran thus far, at least reportedly, having only tried to hack emails associated with the Trump campaign. We don't think that the tea leaves there necessarily read that Russia and Iran will just duke it out and Iran will support whoever the Democrats nominate and the Republicans will be rooting for Trump. We don't see that as where that's going.
No, I bottom line, all these actors are extremely opportunistic. Mm-hmm. Where they see a way to gain some advantage or they see a weakness, they'll exploit it and then figure out what to do with it later.
Mm-hmm. And I think what you've touched on in terms of the kind of consistency of Iran's messaging and the heavy focus on foreign policy. It seems like, we've learned increasingly since the 2016 Republican primaries that isolationism is not really a thread within just one party. We have candidates who want to get troops out of the Middle East in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. So it's possible to be able to promote those viewpoints through social media, stirring up outrage around Yemen and Israel, but without doing it exclusively in support of one party.
That's right.
Okay. So next, I want to get back to you, Steph, to talk about this group, Turla. So Turla was recently reported by the NSA in the United States and the equivalent GCHQ in the United Kingdom of having hijacked Iranian hacking infrastructure and having used its hacking tools to target organizations in 20 different countries. Is Russia using Iran as a launching pad for cyber attacks in order to throw off researchers? And is there a chance we could misdiagnose 2020 election interference as Iranian when it is actually a Russian false flag?
So this is a really interesting discussion and really subject to consider. So Russia does have a history of trying to throw off researchers. They've used some obfuscation techniques and have definitely tried to point the finger to other entities before and deny any activity. So I do think that, since they've successfully used Iranian infrastructure, that they could do it again. And that we could certainly misattribute any 2020 election interference to the wrong party. I think that's easy to do in cyber regardless. Attribution is extremely difficult. And we're also not always seeing the full picture because both Iran and Russia are sophisticated enough to cover their tracks and to use infrastructure worldwide. They've definitely demonstrated that. So I think that we'll see them use the same TTPs, the engineering and the spear phishing again, because it works and because it's been successful thus far.
If I can just for one brief second for our non-technical listeners, can you spell out what TTP means?
Yeah, sure. So tactics, techniques, and procedures. Yeah, TTPs. So I think that they will continue to copy each other and use the same TTPs for interference. But how the relationship is going to shake out between Russia and Iran and how they actually go about it as it gets closer, that's going to remain to be seen. I don't think that Russia will completely overtake Iranian infrastructure and just hang them out to dry and just say, well, Iran did everything. But it's a possibility. I don't know. It's just, I think right now we need to observe more what the two countries do as the time moves forward before we can make any definitive predictions as far as, using a launching pad or just misattributing attacks and any cyber activity to either country.
Mm-hmm. Right. We are almost out of time, but I've got one last question I'd like to ask you both. So Iran entering the disinformation space is a really scary prospect, considering how fractured our politics in the United States has become since Russia was interfering in 2016. We've seen conspiracy theorists that have staying power to this day, including that the emails Russia leaked had actually come from a DNC staffer who was murdered, or that the whole operation was fabricated by CrowdStrike in an elaborate Ukrainian conspiracy. With Iran increasingly operating in this space, it seems like it's only going to become harder to have a civil body politic and a shared sense of facts and reality. What is your advice to our listeners in the United States and around the world to stay ahead of the Iranian cyber threat and identify and deal with its disinformation campaigns? We'll start with you, Emerson.
First advice, just check your sources. Having looked at a lot of these influence activities and these different identified campaigns, I'm convinced most of the Iranian disinformation actors are actually probably civil servants associated with the state broadcaster who are trying to meet quotas. They don't seem like particularly savvy operators, nor are they even like young Russian trolls. They're pretty transparent, actually, about their point of view and about the content they produce. Most of the stories that are shared are often a direct copy-paste from an official Iranian state broadcast source. Even some of the Facebook pages we've looked at, there's this huge Facebook network across India, Indonesia, Malaysia. Because of recent Facebook policy changes, you could look at who owned and operated the page. And the affiliation of the operators was actually with the IRIB, the Iranian state broadcaster. So they don't try particularly hard to hide their identities when they're conducting these sorts of campaigns. So if you just check the sources, and if something is unsourced or not clear about, any information about the website or who runs a given Facebook page, that's a clear red flag and makes it more likely that this might be part of some foreign influence operation.
Steph, anything from you?
Yeah, I would add to that, in addition to validating sources, I feel like, with social media or news, everything is kind of like a college paper now, and you can't have one source verification. You need like 3 to 5. So I definitely really appreciate that piece of advice. And then just be skeptical of everything and do your own research and just take your own opinion and consideration, because, cyber and social media is very murky, and we've discussed all the false flags and impersonation, and nothing is as it seems. So don't take things at face value, research what you're seeing or what you're being approached with. Be curious, be skeptical, because it's really worth it to get to the bottom and understand if something is just untrue and you're kind of being targeted.
Got it. Well, thank you. Thank you both so much for your time and for joining us on the podcast. And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see, or I guess you'll hear from us all next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.